Water meeting come to order, please. First order of business, are there any bill introductions? Any bill introductions? Seeing none. Well, we'll move right into our program today. We're going to get an update on dam safety programs from Mr. Earl Lewis, the Chief Engineer, Kansas Department of Agriculture at this time. Mr. Lewis, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A long time no see for everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be before you again here today and give you a little bit more detail about one of our programs. I think we've got some slides coming up here in just a minute. I will introduce Terry Medley is with me today. He's our Water Structures Program Manager. So if there's any difficult questions, Terry's going to bail me out hopefully here. But we've got a great staff, and I'm happy to have Terry leading that group and does a lot of work. So I'll cover kind of some high-level information here and touch on a few of our challenges and maybe offer a few suggestions if you're so inclined for some things we think maybe the program might be improved in how we serve folks. So let's go to the next slide. Again, at the high level piece here, when we talk about water structures, we're really talking about 4 different laws that we have all or a piece of within the Division of Water Resources. I'll touch on a couple of those briefly, and then of course spend most of my time on dam safety. Levee Law and Obstruction and Streams. So Obstruction and Streams is really where the dam safety program lies. Both those were passed in 1929. We have a piece of the Watershed District Act with the formation and a lot of the permitting that goes along with that in the 50s, and then floodplain zoning in 1991. So we've got a very long history. I know we talk quite a bit about the Appropriation Act and it being in place for 45 years, how long that is. When we think about levees and obstructions and dams, that goes clear back to 29. So really our longest serving statute. Let's go to the next slide. When we talk about the levee law, again, I'm just going to highlight these real quick here. 1929, and again, all of these acts under the Water Structures Program really are safety, protecting life and property acts. And so trying to manage that. And so when we think about levees, obviously people put levees up to protect their own property. We want to regulate that and manage that just so that somebody doesn't put too much of a levee on one side of the river, shove all the water on somebody else's property and cause damage to other individuals that maybe don't have an interest in that levee. That's kind of the balance there that we try and strike and obviously have a whole system set in place. Just under 1,600 levees that are permitted, and so we know that there's more out there. There's a lot of ag levees out there that really aren't permitted. Some of them aren't required to be permitted based on their size and where they're at. There's probably some out there that probably should be permitted. That's just kind of the way that this works. But again, that's been around for a long time. Let's go to the next one. Floodplain zoning. And so this is in concert. This is a federal, state, local initiative with FEMA at the federal level with the flood insurance program, and the state of Kansas through DWR helps to manage the National Flood Insurance Program in the state of Kansas. Our part is kind of twofold. First, we help manage a lot of the work. We get grants from the federal government through FEMA to then go out and help put flood mapping in place for communities, municipalities, counties to try and make sure we know where the 100-year or the 500-year flood is at. That helps to support the insurance program. And then we also, when a community wants to opt into the National Flood Insurance Program, part of our job is to make sure, work with them and make sure their ordinances match what they're trying to do, match what the federal regulations are and match what the community is trying to do. So we provide some advice there as well. Let's go to the next one, please. Where I'll spend most of my time is in the Obstructions of Stream Act, again, 1929. And so this is anything where you are changing the course, current, or cross-section of a stream or putting in an obstruction in the stream. And again, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're managing that activity so that it doesn't cause harm for somebody else. That's the primary purpose. You'll see that, again, when in 1929, been amended over the years. In 2013, I'm going to talk about was the last significant amendments to the obstructions of stream, really declassified or deregulated a number of dams in the state of Kansas. You can argue whether that's a good or bad thing. It has some implications I'm going to come back to us on some of our other way we operate the program. But really what the major change was, in round terms, it used to be that any dam that held back at least 50 acre-feet of water required a permit from the state of Kansas in order to be built, and then it was inspected on a regular basis. In 2013, that went from 50 to 125 acre-feet. So about 150% increase in size. Again, I can't tell you one's better than the other or why that's a good or a bad thing, and I'll tell you why it has some implications for us here in just a minute. Let's go to the next one. Again, what we're trying to, when we talk about dam safety, what we're trying to permit, regulate, and most importantly, prevent is dams that fall into disrepair and then fail when we get into a flooding situation. Doesn't happen all that often. I think over the years, the nation has put in a pretty good dam safety program across the board, but we still do have dam failures, and we do here in Kansas as well. Luckily, we haven't had anything in recent years that's caused us any real large damage in property or loss of life. But even a couple of years ago, there was some significant dam failures in Michigan that did cause significant property, and the slide that's up there is from a town that was below one of those dams that failed, and a lot of property and some personal loss as well. So it does happen. Again, that's what we want to prevent. We want to get ahead of it, make sure it doesn't happen. So let's go to the next one. So again, there are just under 6,700 dams in the state of Kansas that are at least 50 acre-feet. And so there's a national inventory of dams that all the states put all their information into. That's for each of those dams, there's information on where they're at, what size they are, when they were built, some of those kind of things, some basic information. And you might expect over the years, we get more and more and better information. So some of our older dams, we have pretty limited information. Some of our newer dams, we have better information, as you might expect. But there's 6,700. And again, each one of those dams prior to 2013 was regulated by the state. If you wanted to build that dam, you had to get a permit, and then we had to have inspection. Let's go to the next one, please. Right now, there's 2,400 and almost 2,500 dams that are regulated by the state of Kansas again. So we've had about 2/3 of the dams between 50 and 125 acre-feet that were essentially deregulated in 2013. And so the thing I forgot to mention here is the color coding on the map. Each one of those little dots is where a dam is at. High hazard is the red, blue is significant hazard, and then green is low hazard. And what that really means, we're talking about hazard classification, is what's below the dam. So if you got a house that's below the dam, that if the dam fails, then water's going to cause damage to that house, might cause, if you got somebody living there, if we got property and life in danger, that's going to cause us a high hazard dam. Or if we've got a road that's really frequently traveled, or a railroad that's frequently traveled, where again, there might be life and property at risk. If that dam fails, then that's going to be a high hazard. Significant hazard, maybe there's a structure down there, but it's not really habitable. So it might be a shed down there, a low traveled road, county road, that might be significant hazard. Low hazard really are the ones, we have the bulk of our dams in the state of Kansas are low hazard, and they're really ones that you see out across the countryside where if they break, might cause some damage to a farm field, to a pasture, but there's really not any roads, structures, and certainly not any life at stake if those dams fail. And so what we're really looking at is kind of a risk analysis, if you will. There's technical work that goes into if that dam fails when it's full, what's that area downstream that's going to be inundated by that break. And so that's really what determines the hazard classification. That also means that if I got a higher hazard dam, I'm going to have it inspected more often. Again, we want to mitigate that risk. And so if it's a high hazard dam, we want somebody to look at that, inspect it every 3 years, if it's significant every 5 years, and low hazard, there really isn't an inspection requirement. Let's go to the next one, please. So again, you see the total numbers. And so currently there are 264 high hazard dams that are state regulated, and 153 that are significant hazard out of 2,465. I think one of the questions we have thinking forward, and we don't have a proposal for you this year, but thinking forward as we look at this program and try and make sure we're doing our job, is the numbers that are high hazard, for example, that are not state regulated. What's really the risk there If you've got something between that 50 and 125 acre feet, but you've got housing below, then what should the state's role, what should be the individual dam owner's role be in that process? And again, I think we've got to do some more work on that from a policy perspective, making sure we understand what other states are doing and come back with something in a future session to say, we think it's right, or we think we ought to make some tweaks to it to address some of those, especially those ones that are higher significant hazard that are unregulated at this point. So let's go to the next one if we could, please. So what does it mean when we say that it's a state-regulated dam? This is kind of the circular life cycle, if you will, of a dam. And so if you wanted to go build a dam on your property, or if the city did or the state did, they go out and hire an engineer, makes a determination of whether that's jurisdictional or not. And so they'll send us information about the location, the general size, some general information on their design, and we'll make a determination, yes, that's state jurisdictional, or no, it's not. It becomes an exempt dam if it's below that 125 acre feet. If it is jurisdictional, they'll submit an application for a water structures permit and a water appropriation permit. Right, you got to have a water right. You're still diverting water because you're storing it. We'll go through that review process. We'll coordinate with the other agencies. The ECA means Environmental Coordination Act. That's a state act that requires that the agencies, when we get something like this in, we kind of route that around within a 30-day period to other agencies like the Water Office or KDHE or Wildlife and Parks, some of the folks you've been talking to, a whole host of agencies to make sure that there's not something else that the state needs to be paying attention to, or that they've got some advice for these folks to make sure that we're doing a good job at the state level, trying to be coordinated. And I think that's really from the, in the past, maybe we would issue a permit and then find out later that KDHE should have had something, or vice versa, and then it's kind of messy, and going back and permitting something that is already in place and another agency's already permitted is very difficult. So we would make it through all that process. We issue the permits, construction begins. We go out and inspect it during construction, make sure they're following the requirements of the permit, periodic safety inspections and hazard classifications. One of the things that's been an issue policy-wise over the years before the legislature is, what if I build my dam to say a significant hazard or a low hazard, and then somebody on the adjacent property builds a house where maybe they shouldn't, and now their house is in danger, but it changes the classification on my dam. That means I've got to now go out and do more inspections. There's higher safety requirements. Who's responsible for upgrading that dam or monitoring it more closely because of somebody else's action? That's still the way it is today. It's still the dam owner's responsibility, but there's been different proposals over the year on that too. And then, of course, maintenance. And then if we want to modify, we start the process over again. We make sure that if they want to increase the size of the dam, they want to change it, we want to make sure that it's still in a safe condition. Let's go to the next one, please. So how long does that take? Design, again, depending on how big and complex it is, 3 to 6 months. Jurisdictional determination, that we turn that around really within about a week. Somebody sends that in, we look it over pretty quickly and get back out to them. If not, if we go through the application review process, if it is jurisdictional, you're talking 3 to 6 months, again, depending on its location and complexity. Construction 2 to 4 months, so you've got anywhere from 8.5 to 16 year and a half, basically, of from start to finish. And then again, safety inspections, 3 to 5 years, depending on your classification. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. And I think that's one of the things that causes most consternation from folks is if I built this right and the state thinks I've done things right, why am I still here talking about this? Let's go to the next one. One of the things that one of the things that we have we've struggled with, you'll see our funding for our staff and operations to do the permit reviews, the inspections, and then go out and monitor is a combination of state and federal dollars. And so you can see on the red line is the state dollars have held fairly steady, had a little bit of decline there in between 9, 10, and 11, that area. The big one really is from federal fiscal year 16 to 17, and again tied in with those changes that were made in 2013, because part of our federal grant is tied to how many dams are considered regulated by the state of Kansas. And so we saw about a $300,000 loss, give or take, in the amount of money that came from the federal government for us to pay for staff and operations in order to service that. Now, part of that is if we don't have the regulation, then we have a lower workload. That's absolutely true. But part of that is we still have to make that jurisdictional determination, and we want to turn that around pretty quickly. So if somebody sends something in and says, hey, is this jurisdictional, we've still got a little bit of a workload there that there's no permit, there's no state funding, and there's no federal funding to service that right now. I shouldn't say there's no state funding, but that's where our state funding is going. But it really means that we're taking hours away from something, another dam that is being permitted, that is, somebody has a permit fee, and there's federal dollars to help pay for that. And so we are starting to see our time to review and time to get inspection reports reviewed. Those things continue to creep up over time as we have less and less staff. If we go on to the next slide, where do we fit within the nation? You can see Kansas, the funding per regulated high hazard dam. We're about $1,200 per regulated high hazard dam. The national average is about $4,500. And likewise, regulated dams per FTE, we have about 700 dams per employee. We've got 3.5 employees that are dedicated to covering the entire state of Kansas on dam safety. And the national average is about 200. So we're not here saying that we should be where the national average is, but we do want to make sure that we can meet our statutory obligations, keep things moving on a timely basis, and we're not doing that. And so one of the things that I do want to highlight, I know you're not a budget committee, but there is a recommendation in the governor's budget for some additional state general funds to help cover some of that gap of the funds we lost from the federal funding. And again, that means we can probably, if that makes it all the way through, try and hire about 3 more staff to kind of get us back up to where we think we should be. One of the things that we asked Terry and his staff to do early last year was go back and we track all of our time pretty closely. And so we can tell you how long it takes to do a permit review or an inspection review or any of those kind of things. And then we know how many of them we are supposed to be doing. So it becomes a pretty easy math problem. If you take one times the other, you say this is how many hours we need each year to cover that task. And then we divide that by the number of people we need to have. Well, we need to have about 6 people to do all that work just to meet the current demand on the current state regulations. And so we're happy with the governor's recommendations. We hope you will be too. Put us in a better position to try and serve that need. Let's go on to the next one. I'll talk about a couple of more policy or statutory changes we may think about here as we go along. One is a slight tweak in the statutory language that says that an inspection of a dam has to be conducted by a professional engineer. And so we still want the professional engineer oversight, but what that really means is right now, if I as a professional engineer hadn't passed his PE license, even though they may be really good, I ought to be able to send them out, collect all the data, oversee them when they get back in the office, and then do the work, send that report in. Right now we can't do that. What that really means is it really drives up the cost of the inspection, right? Because typically your professional engineer is going to get paid more than somebody who hasn't got their professional engineering license at this point. We think there's a number of tasks to be done in the inspection process that don't really require that professional engineer license. We want to try and bring that cost down and make that a little easier to accomplish. And so again, we want that language changed from being conducted by an professional engineer to under the supervision of a professional engineer. And you can see the number of hours it takes by the time you do the whole thing. We're talking about 60 hours, give or take, on the engineering firm side, and another 8 hours on our side. So $5,000 to $7,000 is not out of the question when an individual goes and asks for a consulting firm to cost for an inspection. If you're doing that every 3 or 5 years, especially if you're on that 3-year clock, that gets to you pretty quick. It can be an unexpected cost. Let's go to the next one. Lack of enforcement tools when we do find a problem. Right now we know that there's 29 high or high hazard dams that have either poor or unsatisfactory conditions. So poor means we need to be thinking about doing something. Unsatisfactory means we got a problem right now. And so there's 29 of them out there that we need to have action. Some of these we've known about for a number of years. And so we have tried to take action even if we send them an order. We have the ability to order them to do something. But right now, in order to enforce that order, we've got to go to the local county attorney and the district court to get enforcement. As you can imagine, they are focused on a number of other things and at times are not all that interested in taking up these issues. And so there's a lot of dams out there that need restoration, need action. We don't have the enforcement tools. And so we're thinking about civil fine authority. Again, we're not interested really in going out and collecting a whole bunch of money or issuing a whole bunch of civil fines. But we also know from our appropriation side that that's a motivator to get folks to pay attention to a problem. And that's really what we want. We want the problem, these dams to be in a safe condition. We want issues to be addressed. And so that's what we're really focusing on here. Let's go to the next one. Emergency Structure Fund. Likewise, once we find that there's something that's in a failing condition, the picture is actually a dam just this last year from just up east of Hoyt. It was owned by a homeowners association. And that's a trench that's essentially been eaten away because the pipe is failing and the dam is slowly eroding away. And we were monitoring this and go up every week or so, and it would be eating away further at the dam. And so finally we said, we've got to take action, issued an order for them to breach the dam. If you do it under control, then you don't have a situation where we have a heavily trafficked county road and a home downstream that are in danger if it breached, but we want to bring in a backhoe and do that in a controlled fashion. We issued an order, again, just like we talked about in the last slide. They don't have, $10,000 sitting around in their homeowner association budget to pay that. They don't have the funds readily available. And so because we were in a declared emergency, we were able to get some access to some funds and do that to breach that dam and bring that into a safe condition. But we don't have a standing fund to do that. If we didn't have a state declared emergency at that time, we wouldn't have been able to take care of that situation. And at some point over the last year, that dam would have breached and we might have a bigger problem. And so we'd suggest establishing an emergency fund. Again, think about putting some money into it. When we have a situation like that, we can take care of the problem with the condition that when they fix the dam, then the state gets repaid the dollars to take action in the first place. So again, and this is something that's required by our National Dam Safety grant. And so at some point they're going to come ask why we haven't taken care of that requirement as well. So let's go to the next one. A couple of exemptions that we think are helpful here. One is if you've got a road fill, and so you think about if you're out on the highway or a single county road, at times you get a really heavy rain, you might see some water backed up against the road. Those essentially act as dry dams, right? They store water until it drains through the culvert. So right now, we have to permit them as if they were a dam. As you might imagine, how you build a dam versus how you build a road, two very different things. And so we end up spending a lot of time, the applicant spends up a lot of time explaining what they're doing, and we have to spend a lot of time going through the permitting process and waiving a whole bunch of things. We think that ought to be permitted as an obstruction, but not a dam. And so again, it's a little bit of a waiver. Likewise, you see the picture there, a low head dam within the channel also has to be permitted as a dam that you're going to store water in. Really, their purpose is just to raise the water level so you get an intake or something there, different purpose. But we're still, because there's not an ability to exempt them out of that dam safety program and put them in the proper perspective of an obstruction rather than a dam, they're going through a lot of the same requirements, the same effort that's beyond what they really should be doing. And we are as well. And so we think both of those are exemptions we should consider both for the applicant and for the program, make everything a little more streamlined. And then last, let's go to the next one, please. Last but not least, we're always advocating for additional funding for aging infrastructure. A lot of these dams were put in with a 50-year lifespan. 50 years is a long time unless you're 53. And then the time's up, right? And so we're starting to see a lot of these that have problems with either the pipes or erosion or sedimentation, and there's not funding, again, put aside to really deal with that problem, or these kind of can pop up. The picture on the screen is one up by Sabetha in 2019. Again, a high hazard dam that was failing during the flood of 2019, and you can't see it, but just off screen is Sabetha's wastewater treatment plant, which again, if that dam had failed, would have caused significant damage and troubled the wastewater treatment plant and then Sabetha itself. So this is a watershed district dam, and so they're in the process of getting it fixed, had the funding, but there's a lot of dams out there that are in need of assistance that don't have that. We're hopeful that some of the federal funding money will be able to go towards some of these, but our understanding at this point is most of that is going through the federal program. So a lot of the watershed dams that were funded partially by federal funds in the beginning may be eligible, but if they were funded by state funds or local funds, there may not be as much access to those infrastructure dollars going forward. We're still trying to figure out how we can get funding to some of those other non-federally funded dams to fix them up, but it's a work in progress. So I think that's all I have, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and appreciate the opportunity again to appear before you and give you a little update.
Thank you for the presentation. Very good. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things that one of them I brought out last year, but my first question is we had a case in Sumner County where we had a huge amount of trees that were piled up against a railroad bunker, a bridge.
Right.
So big controversy between who should get rid of those trees that are trees and trash that were blocking the railroad, under the railroad tracks. So the county didn't want to do it. The railroad didn't want to do it. So who do you say is that, who has jurisdiction over that?
Typically for things like that, the county has jurisdiction and has responsibility. There are times when there's critical infrastructure, and again, I don't know the exact situation whether that would fit or not, but there are times where the Corps of Engineers has funds for emergency removal of snags and blockage like that. But typically, it's the county that is responsible for those activities.
Okay, it didn't seem like that was happening. And then on the same hand, that same flood, lots of trees, trash went through a township area, and the township is required to clean up thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, again, that could be either a FEMA or that could be a township kind of thing. So any thoughts on a situation like that where the trash, trees are plugging up a roadway?
Yeah, so again, I think it depends on whose roadway it is, right? Typically, it's the county level or the township. And then if the FEMA question would be, and again, you might need to get somebody from Department of Emergency Management to clarify what the rules are, but the whole county has to be declared to be an emergency before there's funds that are available for reimbursement to the township or the county for those activities. But we know that there's things like that do happen because, again, in 2019, there was a pretty good effort to try and make sure that we were capturing as much of the damages as possible to get more and more of those counties eligible so they could get some of that FEMA funding reimbursement. Sometimes that works, sometimes it didn't, but we really need to make sure we know what the limit is, the minimum is you got to get over as a threshold on damages before we can start accessing some of that FEMA dollars.
And then my last question, and I think this was a follow-up from last year. I had a constituent that was farming in a piece of land, and over the last 20 years has had a washout between one section of their land to the other. I mean, it was just kept washing out and washing out. I think we brought this up last year. And first of all, got to the point, couldn't hardly get his truck through, and then couldn't get his ATV through. So he came out and said, well, let me get a bulldozer and some riffraff and fill this hole up so I can do that. And then the bulldozer guy said, well, I think I need an engineer. This is becoming a dam because I'm stopping up the water. This was water that had just been runoff over years. And so then the engineer was going to say that they needed to turn it over to you guys because now it was becoming a dam. And all this guy wanted was to be able to access the other side of his field. But it was just had washed out. And that doesn't seem to be fit that area of being a dam.
Yeah, and I don't know, I don't remember your specific example. I'll give you another one that we're dealing with here or have been dealing with this last year. It's not in your district, luckily, for you anyway. But again, the statutory language says if you change the current cross section or flow of the stream, sorry, blank there, then you have to have a permit. And that may be too narrow, but we don't have haven't looked at it well enough to have a good fix for it. Because the one that we're dealing with up on the Solomon River, is a producer that had some stream bank erosion moving towards a county road, moving towards the homestead. Went in and did some work. Well, he's changing the cross section of the stream. So by statute, we're supposed to have a permit. His argument is, well, I'm trying to do what you want done anyway, which is true. We want to make sure it's done in such a way that it doesn't, cause trouble somewhere else. I think I don't have a great answer for you other than to say we recognize it's a problem. We want to figure out how to do a better job of that. But it is an issue at times.
This is just erosion,
Yeah.
erosion, and cause a problem. But when the landowner wanted to fix that, it became a state problem rather than a personal problem.
Right. Yeah. And again, the statutes are about governing, human activity, not natural activity. And so when we get that conflict, if somebody's trying to repair some erosion or something, how do we do that in an effective manner? Again, so it's done well. We also don't want people spending money on and then thinking they've done a good job and maybe they haven't, and then they wasted money and it just washes right back out. So we want to be helpful for that. And again, I don't have a great answer for you, but we do recognize that's an issue.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lewis, for your really comprehensive presentation. I have a few questions. On the slide where you list the example dams that have failed recently, do you know if any of those dams were less than 125 acre-feet capacity?
I don't think so, but Terry, do you know?
The National Dam Safety Program basically says anything over 50 acre-feet needs to be regulated. Those two Michigan dams, I believe, were actually under 50 acre-feet, and those were the most recent and have a lot of headlines to them. So yes, there was quite a few that have been under 50 acre-feet. Of course, Oroville's the extreme, and it's a huge, huge dam. So, but they range everywhere. I'm Terry Medley. I'm with the Division of Water Resources, Water Structures Program Manager.
Thank you so much. So that is really concerning, and I'm just wondering, does your division have recommendations for whether a study should be done to determine what the right amount, or what the right capacity for a dam should be in order for it to be regulated? Do you have any insight into that?
I think we ought to be looking at not only what the right size is, but what are the things that we need to be looking at in an inspection at different times of the age of the dam, and what's our frequency. Again, if I can see if I just put in a brand new dam, made it through all the permitting and the first inspection, and 3 years later I'm going to come back and do another inspection, another 3 years, and everything's in good shape, it's pretty young, I'd be wondering why I'm spending another $5,000 to $7,000 every 3 years. Now, if we get out there 20, 30, 40 years, when we start to see problems develop, then I think that we've got to figure out what's the right frequency based on the risk and on the age and on the situation. And so I do think that there's some opportunity for improvement there. Again, that'll lessen the burden on the dam owner and also on the state as well for keeping track of those things.
Thank you. As a quick follow-up to that, as a temporary solution, is there any benefit in keeping the existing number? It sounds like you guys are looking into what a better number might be, but then adding the classification of high hazard dams as well. If there are the 63 high hazard dams that are not currently regulated, that's also kind of concerning, but I don't know if you guys have the staff capacity for that or what your insights are into that. Thank you.
I guess we haven't really thought about it that way, to be honest with you, and so I don't have a great answer for you on what that is. I think, I think we'd want to look at let me back up just 1 second. Even within the high hazard, significant hazard, that there can be a broad range of risk, right? I mean, one house below or one shed that can be lived in gets you in a high hazard. Is that the same as having a whole housing development, for example? And so, I think we'd want to look at that before we'd say, yeah, let's make sure we got all those in. And I think we have trouble, you're right, with staffing the way it is at the current level. So adding some additional dams on there we have to worry about, not that we don't worry about them, but that we have to monitor would be probably something we couldn't get to.
Thank you. And then last question here. So I think you mentioned this a couple times, but when you're talking about the emergency structure fund, did you say that was required by the federal dam safety grant? So we're currently not in compliance with that. And does that risk our federal funds if it's not addressed? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Orr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Earl. Once again, this is a critical piece of the puzzle that I seldom think about. You said 6,700 dams. About how many applications do you get for dams a year that are over the 50 acre feet of water? And about how many of them are approved or disapproved? And this is just a hypothetical question.
Thank you. Terry Medley, Water Structures Program. It varies. We usually get, in the recent years, we get about 15 applications for modification. In other words, a pipe is failing or they've had erosion to the emergency spillway. Currently, we get very few new dams because of mitigation requirements from the Corps and things like that. But we do still get some of the, well, we get quite a few of these determinations to see if they're exempt. We get probably, I think the last quarter we had 22 just determinations.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
If I could, Mr. Chair, one thing I'd like to add on to that, you know, he mentioned we have 15 applications for modifications. Well, as we get, if there's more money from infrastructure, right, part of the reason we only get 15 is because there's no money to fix the dam. And so if there's more money available to fix the dam, there's going to be more applications that are going to come in. Now, I don't expect it's going to go 15 to 200, but it will be more as more money comes in to fix those dams.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going right on to that question then, so if, on a positive note, if a rancher or a farmer was to go someplace to ask what a recommendation would be to put in a small dam for water for their cattle for some reason, right? So I know personally that I've asked before at the extension agency of, well, do you have some recommendations of how this should be done correctly? And they would say no. So is there someone in your department that for a small reasonable fee could come out and make a recommendation to people? Let's say a rancher in western Kansas would put in a request to someone to, what is the right way to do safely put together a dam, that kind of thing?
I think here's what I'd say. Well, one, if they're going to extension, the local conservation district might be a better fit. They might have more access to some information. They can certainly call our office. Again, I think we're pretty strapped on staff to go out and be helpful to folks. We would like to be in a position to go be helpful and advise folks on the front end of the right way to do things, so we'd have less issues on the back end. But we don't have the staff to do that. We also might be able, if they call our office, we might be able to point them in directions, maybe some informational, educational materials that would be helpful as well. Unfortunately, that's about as good as we can do under current situation.
Did that for a small fee or whatever? I mean, where is that experience? Where is, in the state of Kansas, who has that experience, who has that knowledge that would keep someone from working against a regulation that you would get them into trouble, where they could do it up front and make everyone happy? You
know, I think, frankly, again, it depends on area, but I think most of the folks that are in with, you know, you certainly go to the engineering firm, that's going to cost you a little bit more money, obviously. What you're thinking about is a farm pond, for example. I think the majority of the earth moving firms, right? Somebody's going to come out and run the bulldozer and the scraper, whatever. Most of those have a pretty good feel. And the Kansas Land Improvement Contractors Association, that's kind of the organization that works with that group. I think they have a pretty good feel as well. So we might point them towards, you know, the local dirt mover or Kansas I want to call it Livestock, because Kansas Land Improvement Contractors Association, or K.S.A. is another good resource.
Representative Newland.
Well, to follow up a little bit on Representative Riley, NRCS will come out there and help design and construct those farm pond facilities and oversee a lot of that. But with that being said, is there NRCS funds available for some of these for help on repairing some of those structures that you do oversee?
There is some, and that's where the ones where we've seen, the 15 that have come in, that's where the majority of the funding has come from. There's been about $500,000 in state water plan fund, give or take, each year for that kind of activity. Depending on how bad the dam is, that can be one or two dams. And there are some federal funds, and we expect, again, with the infrastructure dollars, there's going to be more federal funds come through that pipeline down towards some of those watershed district size funds. I don't know that it'll get down to the farm pond size. In the 2012, 2013, there was also money available both from the state and NRCS to go in and do clean out. When there was drought, there was an opportunity to go in and clean out a lot of the sediment while there wasn't any water in the dam. And so there are unique opportunities like that, but mostly it's through those existing ones that have had some federal funds tied to them in the past.
Are there any of of your level dams, or any of those irrigation type facilities?
I think, there are some. I can't tell you how many, but there are some. And frankly, that was the push in 2013 was because we were starting to see a number of dams being put in northeast Kansas for irrigation purposes that were kind of in between that 50 and 125 acre feet. And so I think there was a question of we're already getting the water right, getting the structure, and so there are some of those, and there are some of them that are regulated, but probably not all that many in the big scheme of things.
And then my last question, if you would. If a governmental entity such as the county would raise a road and all that would actually be a levee and force water more towards the other side.
Correct.
Is there something a person can do with that?
Yeah, so again, we would consider that to be a floodplain fill, or depending on where it's at, a stream obstruction. So you can't put any structure in the floodplain that's going to, again, raise the 100-year flood by a foot and push water onto somebody else's property. And so a lot of our permitting for floodplain fills is those kind of things, where it's the county or the state or somebody that's building, kind of causeway or something across the valley, and we want to make sure that when the next flood comes, that we're not causing damage to somebody else's property.
All right. Thank you so much.
And from our video crowd, Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very interesting presentation. I was a little concerned when I saw those red flags in Johnson County. Wasn't expecting that, but I'm assuming that the major dams in Kansas, like Tuttle Creek, that sort of thing, are all supervised by the Corps of Engineers. What's the working relationship you have with the Corps, and do they volunteer any help to come over and help us with any of our high hazard situations or anything? Maybe you could just explain that relationship a bit.
Right. So two things there. First, again, when you think about the red flags there, remember that's a classification of the risk. And so, yeah, if there's a lot of people in Johnson County, then there's a lot of risk for any dams built there. Doesn't mean that those dams are unsafe or in need of repair. It's a look at what's down below them should that dam break. So again, those probably are, in some ways probably in better shape because they get a lot more attention. You're right on the second part, on the Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. So the 24 federal dams are all maintained and inspected by the federal entities, the Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, that own those dams. I think our working relationship is pretty good. We know when they're doing things. We can participate if we want to. We try and coordinate with them on requirements. Typically, they stay on their side of the line, we stay on ours, and so we don't get a lot of either assistance or oversight from them on dams that are regulated by the state and not by the federal government.
Thank you. I'll sleep better tonight. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? I have a bunch. Well, early on, we talked about zoning of the floodplain, and that's with the FEMA group and all that. So what part do you play in that? Do you collect the LiDAR data, or do they do it?
So yeah, the state of Kansas, again, it's kind of a cooperative effort among all the different levels of government, but the state of Kansas does run the program to collect LiDAR data. So that's kind of that high resolution where you create a 3D map of the topography of the surface of the earth. Then we get federal money from FEMA, contract with private engineering firms to then take that data along with hydrologic data and figure out what area would be inundated in a 100-year flood or 500-year flood. And then that's where a lot of the controversy comes in, right? Because a lot of the original maps, if there is an original map, were done maybe on a 10-foot topo map, and now we're coming up with much more accurate information. Or maybe we've seen areas where there's been a lot of development. We've got more runoff than we thought we had before. And so there's areas where maybe the floodplain expands. And that's where we get a lot of folks that build houses. And now we come in later on and say, here's a new and better map. Now your house is in the floodplain. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to buy flood insurance. It's going to cost you an extra $150 a year. That causes folks a lot of concern, as you might expect. The other side of that is, hopefully, if we've got the map right, when the flood does come, now they've got the insurance to pay for the damage. That's why we have insurance in the first place, right? So our role in that is, in some ways, the middleman in helping to coordinate some of the discussions with the local community. Our folks go out when we have 2 or 3 times during the process and have public meetings, go out early on and tell folks what's going on, get some input from them, go out once we've had kind of a draft map, give the public an opportunity to look at that. We also get some feedback from folks that we don't quite have things right from time to time. And they say, here's, my house actually was raised up. You don't show that. And so we can go back and correct some of those situations. We want to have as accurate a map as possible. So that's the primary our purpose on the technical side. Again, now if the community, if Wamego says, I want to make sure I have a floodplain insurance program, I want to be a partner in that, then we want to make sure that Wamego's ordinance that authorizes that and requires zoning for what can be built in the floodplain and not matches what the state and the federal requirements are. So again, so they have a good ordinance on the front end so that they don't zone somebody in or out of an opportunity because of the way they constructed their ordinance. So that's kind of our role in this.
How often do they do the floodplain maps?
Yeah, well, again, it's kind of not very often, in all honesty. In some areas, we're trying to get the hydrologic data and the LiDAR data for the entire state and get kind of that base map done for the entire state, and then it'll be kind of up to each individual community. So again, some of those haven't been done for 40 or 50 years. And then we got some areas that are developing. They may change every 10 or 15. But it's not very often that the maps change.
For the committee, Wamego requested they be remapped, and as a result, the industrial park was put in a floodplain, and my emails and phone lit up big time. It was an interesting situation, to say the least.
Probably not too many people saying you're doing a good job, right?
Now, you confused me a little bit. You said the state requires permitting for any dam. I've heard 2 terms there, 125 acre feet and 150 acre feet.
125 acre feet. The previous standard was 50 acre feet. In 2013, the standard moved to 125 acre feet. I think I probably said it was about 150% increase, so I'm sorry, apologize throwing too many numbers out at once. Well, something like that.
Okay, now, I also got a little confused. There's almost 7,000 dams in the state.
That are more than 50 acre feet.
Right? Mm-hmm. And, but only 2,500 are regulated.
Correct.
So what about those that are not regulated? Who's looking at those?
Well, so we register them, but there is no inspection requirement. Once they get built, there's no inspection requirement on those.
Because they're under 125 acre.
Correct.
Okay. So now you talked about 29, you have 29 high hazard dams that are poor to unsatisfactory.
Correct.
How many are those in the court now? You have to go through the local jurisdiction?
Just a handful of them, really. But again, because we know once we get to that point, we try and avoid going to the court if we can. So it's just a handful.
So are any of them dangerous enough that we need to be doing something now?
Well, I think, again, going back to the emergency fund, I think there are several of them that we think there ought to be something done right now. I wouldn't say that there's any of them that we know of that are in imminent, going to fail like this weekend. If there are, then we want to try and get that emergency fund to take action right away. But there are ones that we think we need to be taking action. You need to be taking action as the dam owner here as quickly as you can.
Further questions, committee? Mr. Lewis, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Committee, that's all we have on our agenda for the day. Anything else for the good of the committee? Representative Riley.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to, I don't know whether anyone else got this or not, but I just would like to thank Director Owens for this sheet that she brought forward from her crew that basically did a comparison of the 2021 actual expenses. Did anyone else get that? I mean, I appreciate that extra work, so we can do a comparison of the actuals against the governor's and this year's budget. So I just want to say thank you very much for doing that. Appreciate it.
The question is, did you get that, Tony, and put it on the S drive? Okay, she's going to send that to you, so it'll be in our S drive. She just nodded her head, so that'll be taken care of. Anything else for the good of the committee? Representative Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I'm sitting here, I don't remember a great deal of discussion last year about Kansas emergency management. And Representative Riley's question earlier about logs or tree trash up against it was a railroad bridge. Normally that's kind of taken care of by counties if they have the equipment to do that. If not, then they would be required to declare a disaster or ask for assistance, basically, and it's notifying Kansas Emergency Management, and then they kind of coordinate with a lot of different agencies here in the state of Kansas that they might be able to bring some equipment in that would be appropriate for dealing with something like that. So on your particular situation, it kind of starts at local, but then it can move up to state level, or when Joe was talking about the NRCS, National Resource Service Agency, Conservation, that's federal. So however we deal with water issues here in the state of Kansas, we're dealing with all different levels of government as we go through, and that's kind of what complicates things for a lot of us. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, there's ways to deal with that. Anything else for the good of the committee? Thank you all very much. This meeting is adjourned.